Pronto deberé cumplir 90 años. Nunca se me habría ocurrido tal idea y nunca fue fruto de un esfuerzo. Fue capricho del azar. Pronto seré ya como todos los demás. A todos nos llegará nuestro turno, pero quedarán las ideas de los comunistas cubanos. A nuestros hermanos de América Latina y del mundo debemos transmitirle que el pueblo cubano vencerá. Tal vez sea de las últimas veces que hable en esta sala. Emprenderemos la marcha y perfeccionaremos lo que debemos perfeccionar, con lealtad meridiana y la fuerza unida, como Martí, Maceo y Gómez, en marchas indetenibles.
Concluye mi tarea como primer secretario del Comité Central del Partido Comunista de Cuba con la satisfacción de haber cumplido y la confianza en el futuro de la patria.
Porque lo que no pueden perdonarnos los imperialistas es que estemos aquí y que hayamos hecho una revolución socialista en las propias narices de los Estados Unidos y que esa revolución socialista la defendemos con estos fusiles.
Since its victory on the 1st of January 1959 and the declaration of its socialist character on the 16th of April 1961, the Cuban Revolution has withstood an incessant siege from US imperialism. The methods of this assault have varied drastically, as a few examples illustrate. In 1961, the US armed and directed Cuban anti-communists in an invasion of the island known as the Bay of Pigs. Hundreds of failed assassination attempts were undertaken against Fidel Castro through his life. Consistent attempts have been made to encourage Cubans to migrate for the US, to cause labour shortages. The CIA-backed Radio Swan even going so far as to push for the migration of unaccompanied children as part of Operation Peter Pan. Economic sabotage against the revolution has taken many forms, from CIA-backed attacks on Cuban agriculture, including bio-warfare and murder, to the well-known economic blockade imposed by the US on the island, which has cost Cuba over $1 trillion since 1961, $4.6 billion in 2019 alone, and has been described as an act of genocide. Each of these attempts has failed in their objective of overthrowing Cuban socialism. Whilst this is a testament to the tenacity of the revolution and the depth of its support among the masses, it risks painting the picture that it is invincible, and thus of creating complacency among its supporters, particularly internationally. We must be clear that this is an error. In order to take up the defence of Cuban socialism against the process of counter-revolution today aimed at the island, it must be understood concretely.
Communism is a failed system, universally failed system. And I don't see socialism as a very useful substitute, but that's another story. With regard to Cuba, Cuba is unfortunately, a failed state in repressing their citizens.
Between the 11th of July and the 14th of July 2021, protests spread across Cuba at a scale unprecedented since the 1990s and the special period of particular economic crisis following the collapse of the Soviet Union. These demonstrations initially numbered in the high hundreds and low thousands. As they have spread geographically, their numbers have declined still further. Whilst there are real economic problems motivating these demonstrations, particularly food and medicine shortages, it is clear that they have been intimately shaped by anti-communist, counter-revolutionary forces. US flags were paraded through the street by these forces, and, in a few incidents, they have been able to lead demonstrations in violence against Cuba's police force and in looting. The response of the socialist state was a limited number of arrests, but otherwise to draw upon the revolution's popular support among the masses. The Cuban president, Miguel Díaz-Canel, urging supporters of the revolution to take to the streets to confront counter-revolutionary forces on the 12th of July. Whilst pro-government rallies mobilised a considerable number more people than those in opposition to the government, with 100,000 people marching for Cuban socialism in Havana on the 17th of July as one example, the state has given some concessions to the anti-government protests, announcing that customs taxes will be dropped on a number of items particularly subject to shortages, that the electrical grid is undergoing work to improve stability, and greater efforts will be made to procure medications, that directors of state-owned enterprises will be allowed to determine salaries at an increased rate, and that long-planned rules allowing the formation of medium and small-scale enterprises will go into place in the coming weeks. A few, even smaller, counter-revolutionary protests resumed over the 17th and 18th of July.
Separamos a los revolucionarios que puedan estar confundidos, separamos a los habitantes de Cuba que puedan tener determinadas preocupaciones, pero no vamos a admitir que ningún contrarrevolucionario, mercenario, vendido al gobierno de los Estados Unidos, vendido al imperio, recibiendo dinero de las agencias, dejándose llevar por todas estas estrategias ideológicas, vayan a provocar desestabilización en nuestro pueblo, y habrá una respuesta revolucionaria.
The economic developments which have given rise to this political process are complex and multifaceted, but may broadly be understood by viewing the relation between the COVID-19 pandemic and the US blockade. Opponents of the revolution often attempt to portray Cuba's medical response to COVID as inept. Nothing could be further from the truth. At present, Cuba has a mortality rate for COVID at around 0.7%, compared to a US rate, a country with much higher resources, of 1.8%. Rather than leading to a failure of health policy, therefore, the primary impact of the pandemic is as an economic catalyst. In 2020, Cuba's GDP fell by 11%, and imports fell 30% relative to 2019. With tourism serving as Cuba's primary means of gathering US dollars for use on the world market, and the nation reliant upon imports for over half of its food, medicine, and energy supply. It is clear to see how the pandemic has deepened shortages. That the contradictions at hand are the result of imperialism is well illustrated by the question of Cuba's dual currency system, which ended on the 1st of January this year, in a move often called economic mismanagement by counter-revolutionaries. Introduced in 1994, in the special period following the USSR's collapse and the loss of 34.7% of Cuba's GDP. This system was the result of the introduction of tourism and the black market in dollars which followed it. To ensure that the state retained a monopoly on dollars, a second currency tied to the dollar, the convertible peso, was created. The result was two internal markets: Cubans earning convertible pesos, able to purchase scarce goods and benefit from higher purchasing power to encourage their dollars being handed to the state. As the majority of state wages are not paid in convertible pesos, this made many menial jobs in the tourist sector often pay more than important jobs under the socialist state. The primary means by which Cuba is able to continue to import food, the tourist sector, has thus served to disincentivize the means by which Cuba may move away from dependence, developing its agricultural sector under the state for food sovereignty, a process of development already heavily limited by the US blockade's restrictions on agricultural equipment. Whilst a limited and brief portrait, this illustrates the centrality of the blockade in ensuring Cuba is kept dependent and subject to shortages.
Failing all that, the United States has to really look at itself in the mirror and think about options that it's exercised in the past, like what it exercised with Panama, where it deposed Panama of Manuel Noriega, and Panama became a stable democracy for decades and decades. That has to be an option that the United States considers, and it's something that can have ramifications not just for Cuba, it can have ramifications for Nicaragua and for Venezuela, which is tens of millions of people in this hemisphere.
One of the things that you did not ask, but we're considering, is they've cut off access to the internet. We're considering whether we have the technological ability to reinstate that access.
It should come as no surprise that beyond its role in causing shortages, US imperialism has directly cultivated the reactionary movement in Cuba, given it an international platform, and appears to be building toward using it as a pretext for drastic escalation. From the covert funding of Cuban artists with millions of dollars to promote dissent, to the use of Miami-based social media accounts to encourage attacks on the state for money, America's bloody soul is everywhere felt. Since protests began, an army of Miami bots has engaged in persistent information warfare against Cuba on social media, demanding support from the US under the hashtag #SOSCuba. This has been further amplified by essentially the entire Western bourgeois media, many outlets even claiming that photographs of socialist demonstrations in Cuba were of anti-government forces. Whilst failing to create a sustainable mass reactionary force within Cuba itself, this has succeeded in giving the US a platform to justify its next moves. Republicans are now openly calling for military intervention, with Miami Mayor Francis Suarez calling for a military coalition to attack Cuba on Fox News, and Florida Congressman Anthony Sabatini calling for regime change and the execution of Cuba's leadership on Twitter. More reserved for the present, the White House is now looking at forcibly restoring the internet to Cuba after it was shut down for its role in organising counter-revolutionary violence on the 11th of July. A clear strategy is emerging. Using internet infrastructure and subterfuge, the US is organising a counter-revolutionary movement in Cuba to engage in prolonged sabotage, terrorism, and political mobilisation. If this succeeds in gaining critical momentum, it will be used to stage a so-called colour revolution, or to justify US military action. If it does not gain such a critical momentum, then it will be used to politically advantage sections of Cuban society, arguing for greater liberalisation of the economy, forcing concessions to further undermine proletarian rule over production, as has been achieved by even these brief counter-revolutionary mobilisations. A hybrid war is in motion. Socialism is under the most dire assault it has seen in decades.
No fue el triunfo de la revolución. La revolución es un profundo problema de conciencia. La revolución es un profundo cambio de estructura social. Una revolución triunfa cuando un pueblo en su inmensa mayoría toma conciencia real de lo que es la revolución. Toma conciencia real de los cambios que se hacen y toma conciencia real de los objetivos que se buscan. Pero en aquel momento era el entusiasmo de todo el pueblo, que aborrecía aquel régimen derrocado y que instintivamente sentía de que había que hacer un cambio grande. Instintivamente comprendía que había que hacer una política para ellos, aunque ciertamente no tuvieran una idea muy clara, las masas, de en qué iba a consistir esa política.
As it is today in vogue among many capitalist or ultra-left circles to gloat or state with sullen glee that Cuban socialism has already fallen as a consequence of a limited liberalisation of its economy, that it is a so-called sugar colony, or even a gangster's dictatorship. We shall conclude by offering a word on what it is that we defend. In his critique of the Goethe programme, Karl Marx argued that socialism, the lower stage of communism, is essentially a political settlement, whereby production is collectively owned under a proletarian state. That is, a mass democracy serving as a dictatorship over the exploiting classes. Whilst it is undeniable that concessions have been granted to private property, and that the wind continues to blow in this direction, it is equally undeniable that Cuba is such a proletarian state. The private sector, until now confined to tourism, artisanal professions, and small farms, has virtually no control over the means of production and accounts for just 13% of the Cuban workforce. The rest of the economy, between 70 and 80%, is owned by the state. Cuba is a participative democracy, with committees for the defence of the revolution its most fundamental organs, organising around 88% of the population. The influence this mass democracy has is clear when one considers the degree of participation in the formation of the 2019 Constitution, which was discussed in consultations with 8,945,521 participants, around 3/4 of the population, in a process that led to the revision of between 50 to 60% of the proposals, and was approved with 86.4% of an 84.4% turnout. This is socialism, and it has achieved staggering feats. Education to the highest level, housing and healthcare are all free, alongside a basic diet. The nation has the highest doctor-to-patient ratio in the world, has made incredible medical breakthroughs, including a vaccine for lung cancer, and its medical internationalism is astounding, treating more Ebola patients than any other nation globally, and 1.2 million COVID-19 patients internationally, as but two examples. It is the only environmentally sustainable nation on the face of the earth, a 100-year strategy to weather and combat the environmental crisis secured in its constitution. And so we say, without a hint of irony, that the war upon Cuban socialism, whether waged externally or internally, is a war upon human freedom, dignity and survival. It is the duty of the communist movement and of all fellow travellers across the globe to stand now in its defence, demanding the end of the US hybrid war, the end of the US blockade, the end of the slander and subterfuge which have given rise to the contradictions which today plague Cuban socialism. And so we must proclaim everywhere the truth of that well-worn Cuban slogan: Socialismo o muerte. Socialism or death.